Welcome to Powerless Penguins United Big Book Study. This week, I'm pleased to introduce Max D, who is kindly going to carry on with the week 2 of the Big Book Study. So, Max D, over to you.
Thank you so much, Matt. Good morning. Thank you for your service, and to Stephanie and Linda and Kate as well for your service. I love the army of people that are here every day to help us lot. It's great to be here again, and thank you to Kate in Sydney who stepped in for service last week. It was amazing to hear your share. I personally got so much from it, so thank you for that. And if you haven't listened to it, please do. You'll get some inspiration. So we're into the forward to the second edition. I'm just going to run through this at a pace that comes. I don't know where I'm going to end with it. I'm certainly not going to try and rush to get to a particular point. And Julian and I will work in the background in between sessions to see how the pace of it and everything is going, to make sure that it's working for you. So if you haven't got a big book, get one. If you haven't got a sponsor, get one. If you haven't got a home group, get one. Because those three things added up to all of the other stuff that everybody does, like this, the fellowship and the hanging out and the getting together and the chats outside the meeting and all of that. It helps. But you've got to have a spiritual awakening as a result of the steps in order to receive full-blown recovery. The fellowshipping and all of that contact outside of doing the steps and working with the sponsor will give you some short-term relief, but it will not give you full-blown recovery. And I can only talk honestly about my own personal experience, and I'm only telling the truth from what it tells us in the 164 pages worth. And it's the only place that you're going to find the program of recovery, the program of action that's set out only in the 164 pages. So I just want to start with that. I've had a couple of calls in between the last couple of weeks asking some questions and queries about what I went through previously, which is awesome. Keep those calls coming. I'll put my details in the chat, send email address or whatever. Brilliant to get those queries and questions. But if you're listening to this every week, whether you're on the meeting or it's being recorded, doing this and listening to this by yourself does not replace the need for a sponsor. Okay, it's really important. Listening to me may not give you the validation that you require in order to clear everything that you need to clear. You must work this with a sponsor. Anyway, there we go. I think I've talked about that enough. Let's get into the forward to the second edition. It starts on page XV. The second edition was issued in 1955, just 16 years after the first edition was issued in 1939. And the first paragraph that we talk through here, I probably won't do this line by line. I'll jump through this until we get to the next page. But the first paragraph gives a really, really important message that since the first edition was issued in 1939, only 16 years later, a wholesale miracle has taken place. Now, if you go to a wholesaler's, you're going to purchase things in bulk. So basically what they're saying here is there's been a huge bulk of recoveries since the first edition of the Big Book of Alcoholics Anonymous was issued. It goes on to talk about the little quotation at the end that every alcoholic who journeys will find the Fellowship of Alcoholics Anonymous at his destination. Already, continues the area text, 2s and 3s and 5s of us have sprung up in other communities. That quote is actually taken from page 162 towards the end of the book. And it's features in the chapter A Vision for You. Little clusters of 2s and 3s and 5s of us have sprung up in other communities through contact with 2 other larger groups. So the reason why I'm raising that is because this mushrooming process that took place has enabled more and more and more people through the publication of the literature through the publication of the Big Book of Alcoholics Anonymous, the message grew and grew and grew, and more people were able to recover. It then goes on to talk about that in the next paragraph, a few lines down in the second paragraph. In that brief space, in the brief space of the 16 years from the first edition to the second edition, Alcoholics Anonymous has mushroomed into nearly 6,000 groups whose membership is far above 150,000 recovered alcoholics. There's that word again, recovered. Sometimes in the rooms you'll hear people get into this debate and discussion around, well, I'm never recovered. I'm always recovering. Well, you know what? 17 times in the program of recovery and in the program of action, it tells me that I have recovered. And it tells me what I've recovered from. And when we get to that point, I'll let you know what that is and where it features in the first step. I don't get involved in the windy arguments with regards to whether you're recovering or recovered. I can just tell you from my own personal experience, having had a spiritual awakening as the result of the steps, I have recovered. And that's what is promised from the very front cover page. That this book shows us how many thousands of men and women have recovered from alcoholism. It's a promise. And it happens if we do the work. The rest of that paragraph then just goes on to talk about how the publication of the book goes across all of the continents and how many languages it was translated into. The last line when it says, many of our friends encourage us by saying that this is but a beginning, only the augury of a much larger future ahead. I love that line. The word augury means the vision. The people that wrote this book had no idea that this was only the beginning of a vision for a much larger future ahead. Here we are nearly 90 years later, still using the same words from the Big Book of Alcoholics Anonymous. And not one word has changed in the 164 pages. There is a little quote in one of the appendices that was added in 1947. And again, I'll point that out to you when we get to that point. But not one word in the 164 pages has changed in 90 years. Yet the words in this book have the ability to change you if you do what is suggested. Now we're getting into the real stuff here as we go into this next paragraph. The spark that was to flare into the first AA group was struck at Akron, Ohio in June 1935 during a talk between a New York stockbroker, Bill W., and an Akron physician, Dr. Bob. 6 months earlier, the broker had been relieved of his drink obsession by a sudden spiritual experience. In order to have the spiritual experience, you have to have a spiritual awakening as the result of the steps. Hence the reason why this book is so incredibly important to your own personal recovery. So following a meeting with an alcoholic friend, that being Ebby Thatcher, who we learn more about in Bill W.'s story in chapter 1. And don't worry about all of the details of that. As many of you know, I have this phrase that I use, that we grow where we're planted. When I need to tell you a little bit more about Ebby and all of that, I'll tell you when we need to grow where we're planted. But for the context of what we're saying here, following a meeting with an alcoholic friend, Ebby Thatcher, who had been in contact with the Oxford group of that day, basically, Bill was paid a visit by Ebby Thatcher back in the day. Ebby had got sober through the Oxford groups at the time, which was basically a group that had their own way of doing recovery. They had what they called their 6 tenets. And that program was heavily based in Christianity. Very, very heavily based in Christianity. And although Bill had a lot of time with Ebby and eventually got sober, he didn't believe that the 6 tenets of the Oxford group could reach as many people as he knew that he needed to, because of the dimension of Christianity possibly only being able to reach a very small sector of the alcoholic community. So out of his experience, he then developed from the 6 tenets, our 12-step program of recovery. And it goes on to explain here a little bit more about that journey. So not only did he get a little bit of help from Ebby Thatcher, he also had been greatly helped by the late Dr. William D. Silkworth, a New York specialist in alcoholism, who is now accounted no less than a medical saint by AA members. And 100%, that little guy, Dr. Silkworth, absolutely is a medical saint. Had he not written the doctor's opinion, I don't know where we'd be these days, because the words that he uses in the doctor's opinion are so incredibly pertinent to our recovery. And again, we'll go through the detail of that in the next couple of weeks when we get to that chapter. But this is interesting. So Dr. Silkworth, Ebby Thatcher, and it goes on to say his story of the early days of our society appears in the next pages in the doctor's opinion. From this doctor, Bill, the broker, had learned the grave nature of alcoholism. I would circle that word grave, actually, because this is where you get your first death threat in the big book. Sounds a bit harsh, but it's an ominous warning, to use a line from Bill's story. The grave nature of alcoholism, the grave nature of addiction. If you be an alcoholic or addict, you have an illness. Make no mistake about that. And as an illness, it needs to be treated. But there is no medical treatment that can help an addict or an alcoholic. And this is what this book goes on to tell us. And this is what this little piece of the foreword to the second edition tells us. So though he could not accept all the tenets of the Oxford groups, Bill W. did agree with all of the 6 tenets. These next few lines tell us the points that he did agree with. So he was convinced for the need for moral inventory, the equivalent of our step 4. He was convinced by the confession of personality defects, our step 5. He was convinced by restitution to those harmed. That's the equivalent of our step 9. He was convinced by helpfulness to others. That's our step 12. And he was convinced by the necessity of belief in and dependence upon God. That's our equivalent of step 2. So there's 5 things there that he was convinced by in the tenets of the Oxford group. But there's one that he wasn't. Okay? And I'm going to direct you to where you find out where that is. If you go to the personal stories, which are at the back of the book, and go to page 263, there's a personal story there called He Sold Himself Short. Now, I must add that the personal stories that begin on page 171 and work right the way through are not the program of recovery. They are there for a specific reason, and we know we're doing some bits and bobs on that as we go from week to week. But the personal stories are there for you to read as per the first instruction that is in the Big Book of Alcoholics Anonymous, which is found in the last paragraph of the preface. You're reading these personal stories in the order in which they're set out to identify with. If you drank like that, if you felt like that, if you thought like that, and at the end of the story, if you believe this program can work for you too. Okay, so that's the only reason why you're reading the personal stories at the back of the book at this time. But they are not the program of recovery. So you'll see that in He Sold Himself Short, it lists the 6 tenets. So all of the ones that he agreed with are those numbered 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. I've already gone over them. The one that Bill didn't agree with was the first tenet in the Oxford groups, which was complete deflation. And it's important to understand why that differentiation. In his experience with Dr. Silkworth, who treated so many alcoholics and addicts, and with Bill and the first 100 that wrote this book, complete deflation is not our first step. It is the first step of the Oxford group, but it is not our first step. The first step in our program of recovery that is set out in this book is that we admitted we were powerless over alcohol and our lives have become unmanageable. If you're sitting in this room, it is essential that we understand the powerlessness that we have over our illness. It is essential that we let the idea in. To admit simply means to let in. If you buy a ticket to go somewhere, it lets you into the event. All we're doing at this moment in time in step 1 is letting the idea in that we are powerless over alcohol or whatever it is, the drug that you use, and that your life has become unmanageable. This is where the first step starts in the program of recovery. It starts in the foreword to the first edition or the second edition. This is why you have to work the program from the front cover page right the way through to 164, because the thread begins on the front cover page right the way through. The deflation does happen in our program, but there's a particular point when that happens. In your step 1, you have to learn about the fact that you're powerless physically, mentally, that you are hopeless, that you are beyond medical aid, and that there is no medical treatment. There's no pill, there's no addiction service, there's no rehab facility that can ensure your permanent recovery. Yet, having a spiritual awakening as the result of the steps will ensure your permanent recovery. And it goes on to tell us this in the next couple of paragraphs. What happens as you show up with your sponsor over the course of time in understanding your powerlessness? If you keep on showing up, you keep on turning the pages, you keep on trusting the process with your sponsor, the deflation actually happens in step 4 right the way through to step 9. But you've got to understand the illness that you suffer from to be able to take those steps in order for the deflation to take place. And whilst that deflation is taking place in 4 through 9, it might be starting as you turn the pages at the beginning of the program. But when that deflation takes place, basically what happens, there's a vacuum that is then created for something else to get in. Right now, if you're filled with everything to do with your addiction, there's no room for something else to get in. We've got to clear that all down, and that's what happens as you work through the steps. That might not make any sense as you're sitting here listening to me early on a Saturday morning, but your sponsor will explain all of this to you. So we'll get into the paragraph prior to his journey to Akron. The broker, Bill W., had worked hard with many alcoholics on the theory that only an alcoholic could help an alcoholic, but he had succeeded only in keeping himself sober. The important point about this line is that history will tell us that Bill W. travelled around for 6 months after he got sober and did not get one person sober. Now we know that it's not him that gets him sober, it's this power greater than ourselves. I don't get my sponsees sober, it's the God of their understanding. But he travelled for 6 months and didn't get anyone sober through the big book, through the steps. And he came home and he spoke to his wife Lois and he said, this thing isn't working. No one else is getting sober. And Lois, point blank, turned around to him and said, well, it doesn't matter because you still are. I do this stuff, I do this sponsorship, I do this service stuff, I do all of this because I'm an alcoholic, not because you are. I do all of this stuff because it's my prescription from the illness that I have. Now it's a win-win situation because when I give it away to you, you get the same. But I have to do this because I am alcoholic. And I hasten to add that drugs are part of my story. Just for reference. So the important thing here is I do this no matter what. Of all of the sponsees that I work with, doesn't matter how many of them are sober or not, that have relapsed and come back, or who haven't come back. I'm still here doing what I need to do in order to help more and more people. That's the point of this sponsorship thing. Okay? So the broker had gone to Akron on a business venture, which had collapsed, leaving him greatly in fear that he might start drinking again. Get this line. It's incredible. He suddenly realized that in order to save himself, that's the point that I'm making, in order to save himself, he must carry his message to another alcoholic. And that alcoholic turned out to be the Akron physician, Dr. Bob. You'll sometimes hear in the rooms, there's no musts in AA, there's no musts in CA. Is that right? Well, there's one right there. We must carry his message to another alcoholic. And in actual fact, let's blow that myth out of the water that there's no myths in AA. There are. There's 52 times in the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous that tells us that what we must do for our own recovery. Yes, they are suggestions, and this is a suggestive, but I'm going to get into the reasons for that word suggestion when we find it in the book. It's very, very clear. Yes, it is a program that is suggested, but there are 52 musts that we must do to ensure our complete and utter full-blown recovery from the illness that we suffer from. Isn't that incredible? That he realized in one of his moments where he thought he was going to lift up or use again, boom, the solution, I must carry this message to somebody else. So if you're sitting in this room and you've had a spiritual awakening as the result of the steps and you're not sponsoring, maybe just ask yourself, what do I need to do here? What do I need to change? What help do I need to get me on that journey to pick up the book and take another person through it? Because that's my responsibility to carry this message. And you'll see why that's significant as we move on to the next couple of paragraphs. So this physician, Dr. Bob, had repeatedly tried spiritual means to resolve his alcoholic dilemma, but failed. The word means in mathematics means average. So the mean of something is the average of something. So this Dr. Bob tried an average of everything. He dabbled in a little bit of everything. And what happened? Didn't work for him. But when Bill W. gave him Dr. Silkworth's description of alcoholism and its hopelessness, circle that word. Hopelessness means beyond medical aid in this book. So we're beyond medical aid. There ain't no doctor, there ain't no physician, there ain't no consultant, there ain't no psychiatrist that can help us. And it's confirmed here that beyond medical aid, this hopelessness, the physician began to pursue the spiritual remedy. This is a spiritual program of action, a spiritual program of recovery. And please do not be put off by that if you're sitting here, you're new about and you're returning and you're thinking, I don't do this God thing and I don't do this religion thing. That's got nothing to do with it right now. This book is going to show you how to have the spiritual remedy. Do not be put off by the word God. We are going to talk about God, but don't be put off by it because we're going to show you how to find it. So set aside every single thing you think you know about the 12-step program, about your addiction, in order for you to have a new experience with God, whether you have one or not, in order for you to have a new experience with God, and so that you may be shown the truth. Just set every single thing aside that you think you know. Because what you think you know right now isn't working for you. And we're going to show you what does. So Dr. Bob pursued the spiritual remedy, and a remedy is something that a remedy will resolve an undesirable situation. So there's many of us in the room that are probably in a very undesirable situation, but this program of action is going to show you how to resolve it. totality. You will recover. You have recovered, past tense. And here's the thing. So the spiritual remedy for his malady with a willingness. Circle the word malady and circle the word willingness. These are really important. The willingness he had never been able to muster. Our step one is just about a willingness. Are you willing to come to a meeting? Yes. Are you willing to show up? Yes. Are you willing to be of service? Yes. Are you willing to get a sponsor? Probably not. Well, get willing. Are you willing to be willing? It's willingness in your step one. That's all that is required. Are you willing to get up at 8 o'clock in the morning and listen to some crazy horse woman from Belfast? Yeah? Okay. Well, that's demonstrating your willingness. And that's all you need at this point. Show up. Keep on turning the pages with your sponsor. Let the book do the work. Your sponsor will take you by the hand and put your hand into the God of your own understanding. Just be willing to believe what I'm saying. Just be willing. And through that willingness, all sorts of miracle things begin to happen. It's a cast iron guarantee that you will recover if you do this work. The word malady, I love the word malady. And you're probably thinking, why is she, again, crazy horsewoman from Belfast. The word malady back in the day when the book was first written was basically a condition of the heart. When someone went to their doctor back in the day and they were diagnosed with a malady, it was something in relation to your heart. And I'm going to show you through the pages what that means in your recovery. As well as this willingness to show up. And as a result of following that spiritual remedy that is set out in this book, Dr. Bob sobered never to drink again up to the moment of his death in 1950. Get this line, underline it, asterisk it, highlight it, do whatever on earth you need to do to make this next set of lines jump out to the end of this paragraph. This seemed to prove that one alcoholic addict with another could affect another as no non-alcoholic could. It also indicated that strenuous work, one alcoholic with another sponsorship, was vital to permanent recovery. The word vital in this book means life-giving. So what that line is saying is that strenuous work, one alcoholic with another, sponsorship, one person taking another person by the hand, someone that has had a spiritual awakening as the result of the steps, takes another person through to have their spiritual awakening as the result of the steps, and that ensures permanent recovery. Now, when I first came into the rooms, I just then thought it meant happy days, permanent recovery just for me, my permanent recovery. But it's not just about that. This is about spreading permanent recovery across the world, because if I don't sponsor people, how are we going to spread the message? If you don't sponsor people, how are we going to keep on spreading this message? We need to keep this message alive. We need to keep the message of recovery, the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous, in its truest form for the people that don't even know that they need it yet. What happens if we all go home today, happy days, I'm recovered, I've had a spiritual awakening over the steps, I'm just going to go on and enjoy my life. What about my niece and nephew that might need this in 20 years' time? Who's going to give it to them if I don't do this? We're doing this for the people that don't know that they even need it yet, to keep this alive like it has been going for 90 years. So if you're sitting in this room and you had a spiritual awakening as the result of the steps, you're not sponsoring anyone. What are you doing? Yes, it's great that you can be of service. Yes, it's wonderful that you can go to your groups, and it's wonderful that you can carry a message in your home group, and it's wonderful that you can be part of fellowship. But what are you doing to give this away? Because the only way that we learn this stuff is by giving it away to get more back, to keep on giving it away to get more back, so that more and more people can recover. You've been afforded the opportunity to recovery. Why can't we use it to help somebody else? When I speak to my sponsees, one of the deals is, are you prepared to carry this to somebody else when you've had the spiritual awakening as a result of the steps? If they say no, then I can't help you. Now, inevitably, I've yet to find somebody to say no. Isn't that right? There's a couple of them sitting in here. They just nod and go, yeah, I'll do it. And they're doing it. Because they've had faith in the process. They've shown up. They've done what's suggested. And here they are, building an army across the world. We've got Kate in Sydney. We've got somebody else in Switzerland. We've got somebody else in Colombia. We've got somebody else in, I've said this all before, like in the second paragraph of the forward to the second edition, we're across all of the continents, us lot, building a little army of people. And here's why we do it, because in this next paragraph, there's a really important line in here. You know, these two men set to work frantically. The two of them, by themselves, recovered frantically upon alcoholics arriving in these hospitals. And their very first case, a desperate one, recovered immediately and became AA number 3. And you'll read that in the personal stories when you get to that point. He never had another drink. This work at Akron continued through the summer of 1935. Here's the important point. Again, do whatever you need to do to highlight this, to bring this alive to your sponsees when you're bringing them through. There were many failures, but there was an occasional heartening success. That's what I experienced. Many, many failures. But it doesn't stop me from doing this 12-step work, intensive work, one alcoholic with another. There were many failures, but there was an occasional heartening success. And I would ask you now to go to page 159 and you'll find out what that really means. The last paragraph on page 159 tells you the few failures, or the many failures and the few successes. A year and 6 months later, these 3 had succeeded with 7 more. It took them 18 months to get another 7 people. 18 months, there was 10 of them. That's what strenuous work is. That's what intensive work, one alcoholic with another, is. I think that's really enlightening. You know, they frantically ran around the country trying to get this book published. They frantically ran around the country trying to find alcoholics. We're sitting in rooms where alcoholics and addicts are so freely available to us, and we're not offering sponsorship. We're not reaching out our hand. How's the newcomer supposed to know where to find a sponsor? How's a newcomer supposed to know what a sponsor does if we're not approaching them and telling them what this is all about? And that's the other thing. It tells us 17 times in the big book. It tells us 17 times in the 164 pages that it is okay to approach someone and say, you know what, I've had a spiritual awakening as the result of the steps. I have what you need for the illness that is going to kill you if you do not find this solution. We owe it to the people that wrote this stuff, that were frantic and painstaking about getting this out to the world, to continue to carry this message in its truest form. Because when we do, it works. It really and truly does. And they were so convinced by their solution, they took the time to put it into a book so that we could preserve the message and not dilute it, and use it in the truth of what they experienced. And it goes on to tell us that in this next paragraph. This small group promptly took shape in New York, then it grew into Cleveland, and then there was lots of ideas between New York and Cleveland, and it goes on, the 4th line up. By late 1937, the number of members having substantial sobriety time behind them was sufficient, get this line, to convince the membership that a new light had entered the dark world of the alcoholic. A new light had entered the dark world of our existence. our hopeless state of mind and body, where we are beyond medical aid. And what was that light? It was now time, the struggling groups thought, to place their message and unique experience before the world. And why? What did they do? This determination bore fruit in the spring of 1939 by the publication of this volume. The new light that entered the dark world for the alcoholic and addict was the publication of the Big Book of Alcoholics Anonymous, where the only truth of the program of recovery can be found. The membership had then reached about 100 men and women. The fledgling society, which had been nameless, it didn't have a name at that point, now began to be called Alcoholics Anonymous from the title of the book. The Fellowship of Alcoholics Anonymous is not the meetings. Our Fellowship of Alcoholics Anonymous is named after the big book, and it's really important to understand that. Now, in the Fellowship of CA, you invite everybody in that has an addiction. Doesn't matter which that one is. But the program of recovery can only be found in Alcoholics Anonymous. And of course, the flying blind period ended and AA entered a new phase of its pioneering time. It developed, it grew further and further and further. So isn't that really interesting that in those couple of pages in that foreword that some of you probably haven't read? And why would you? Because when I first came into the rooms of Alcoholics Anonymous, I skipped right the way through to the first chapter, or in actual fact, I would have went to the end of the book to read what the ending said so that I knew what was coming up. I remember reading all of those, well, it doesn't even matter what books, but there was a set of like 5 or 6 books that, came out one after the other, and I just went to the end page and was like, all right, is that what happens? And then went back to the beginning again. You can't do that with this book, just so you know. There's no answers like the maths book that you got at school. There's no answers at the back of the book that you can cheat. You have to go through it line by line, word for word, like we're doing here. It then goes into a load of history over the course of the next couple of pages. I'm not necessarily going to go into all of that. There's a couple of highlights that I will bring out. If you go to page XVIII, it talks about the fact that we got help from all of these people. Fulton also was a writer. He wrote articles in magazines and in the press back then, in 1955 when this edition was published. But this brought a rush of 800 frantic inquiries into the little New York office, which meanwhile had been established. And listen to this, each inquiry was painstakingly answered. Pamphlets and books were sent out. Businessmen travelling out of existing groups were referred to these prospective newcomers. New groups started, and it was found to the astonishment to everyone that AA's message could be transmitted in the mail as well as word of mouth. And by the end of 1939, it was estimated that 800 alcoholics were on their way to recovery. So they were painstaking. They were so convinced by this message that they went to the nth degree to get this published and to post it out. They responded to every single inquiry. That's why I have been taught by my sponsor to respond to every inquiry. If somebody sends me a message, I respond. If somebody calls me, I respond. If somebody reaches out, I respond. And if I don't have the answer, I'll give them to somebody else. If they were painstaking to get us to where we are now, why wouldn't we be painstaking to get somebody where they need to be and the people that they're going to help in the future? Talks about John D. Rockefeller. You can read about this all in the history books, the writing of AA and, all the other language of the heart and so on. And I'm sure, I know that CA has all of their literature as well as to how youth have grown and come to fruition and bore fruit. John D. Rockefeller was a very, very wealthy man, and he was the gentleman that advised Bill W. not to open treatment facilities in hospitals. Bill was a businessman. He was a stockbroker. He wanted to make money. John D. Rockefeller said, if you start to make money out of this, it's going to ruin it. He took his advice, and thank God he did. That's why we're the fellowship that we are now. That's why the fellowships only go for tradition 7, your own voluntary contributions. The next paragraphs then go on to talk about the 12 traditions, a really essential part for people to learn. Once we go through the 12 steps, we then go through the 12 traditions. The 12 traditions are put in place within our fellowships to protect us from ourselves, not to protect us from the outside world. The 12 traditions are there to protect us from ourselves. I can't emphasize that enough. It tells us the test that it faced was that could large numbers of erstwhile erratic alcoholics, addicts successfully meet and work together? Would there be quarrels over membership, leadership and money? Would there be strivings for power and prestige? Would there be schisms which would set the fellowships apart? Absolutely. Soon AA was beset by these very problems on every side and in every group, and that's what happens. As groups grow, resentments take place, groups split, more groups grow, but we have to have these traditions so that we are aligned to what our primary purpose is, to carry the message to the still sick and suffering alcoholic or addict. But get this now, this is so powerful. But out of this frightening and first disrupting experience, of all of this vast growth over the first 16 years, what dawned on them was this. The conviction grew that AAs had to hang together or die separately. If we do not hang together, we will die separately. It's as simple as that. Another grave death threat, but we suffer from an illness that wants us dead. That is the reality of it. But there is a solution, and that's what you're given by your sponsor through this book. We have to unify our fellowship or we pass off the same. So our fellowships are unified by the 12 traditions. The 12 traditions are the spiritual principles by which our groups are guided. It then goes on to talk through a summary of the 12 traditions, which you'll find on page 561 at the back of the book. They're demonstrated in the short form and the long form. If anybody wants to go through these traditions, we can make those arrangements. Turn to page XX. This next paragraph is really, really insightful. While the internal difficulties of our adolescent period, so this teenage growth period were ironed out and they started to place in the traditions, public acceptance of AA grew by leaps and bounds. And why was that? For two principal reasons. The large number of recoveries and reunited homes. That's what happens when you have the spiritual experience. A spiritual awakening is the result of the steps. You become recovered, reunited homes. You're a better employee. You're a better family member. You're a better friend. All of those things start to fall in place. But the stats in here are really quite insightful. It tells us of alcoholics who came to AA and really tried. 50% got sober at once and remained that way. 25 sobered up after some relapses. And among the remainder, those who stayed on with AA showed improvement. And other thousands came to AA meetings and at first decided they didn't want the program. But great numbers of these, about 2 out of 3, began to return as time passed. So what they're saying here is, back in the day, 2 out of 3 people used the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous and became recovered. Today, as we sit here in those rooms, we're nowhere near the percentages of recovery because we're not using the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous. We're doing everything but. The only way that you can have a spiritual awakening is as the result of the steps that are set out in the 164 pages. And if you're listening to me and you think I'm a broken down record, I don't care. I genuinely don't care what you think of me. Those days are gone because this program of recovery has enabled me to understand that my purpose is to do this and to carry this message. And I'm only telling you the truth from the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous. I'm not going to get into a windy argument with you about what you think and what you know. And I'm not going to tell you what I think and what I know. All I'm sharing with you is the truth from this big book and how I apply it every single day of my life to remain free from the bondage of myself. I'm interested in what you have to say, but if you don't like what I'm saying, that's okay. It's not going to change my day. In fact, it's going to make me even more determined to do this. So thank you. And you're welcome. Because if you are disturbed by what I'm saying, there's something in you that knows that you need to change. If I have disturbed you about the drink or drug problem, there's something in you that needs to change. In the chapter Working with Others, it tells us if we have disturbed you about the drink or drug problem, then we're doing something right. Because if I've disturbed you about the drink or drug problem, you can guarantee you'll come back next week and you'll want to find out more. Or you'll send me another message. Or you'll want clarification or something. That's absolutely brilliant. So yeah, thank you. And you're welcome. We're going to jump through the last couple of paragraphs of this because I think we still have time. The next paragraph talks about the importance of back in the day, we needed the help from medicine people and religious people and to pass this message on. Hence the reason why the chapters at the back of the book where we practice our principles in all of our affairs, there's chapters to the family afterwards, to the chapter to the employer, to the wives. We needed help from everybody to get the word out about this, to be able to help the still sick and suffering alcoholic. And it emphasizes the fact in the next paragraph, we're not a religious organization. You know, we are a spiritual program. It talks about that we reach all sides of communities. Doesn't matter what your religion is when you come in. It's not a religious program. It tells us then in this last paragraph that it's pyramiding. Our membership is pyramiding at the rate of about 20% of the year, but we can hardly scratch the surface of the problem that we have with potential alcoholics. In all probability, we shall never touch more than a fair fraction. But get these last few lines. Upon therapy for the alcoholic himself, we have no monopoly. There are other things available. You can go to addiction services. You can go to rehab and all of that. But that is not the solution. It will help you on your journey. But when you've been through those health processes, you still have to do this. So all they're saying, the humility of these people is, it is our great hope that all those who have yet found no answer. You might be sitting in this room and thinking there is no answer, but here's the deal, that you may begin to find one in the pages of this book. And as a result of finding them in this book, you will presently join all of us on this high road to a new freedom. Those 15 hands that raise to say they've got a year's sobriety, that will double, that will triple, that will quadruple. But it doesn't matter what time it takes for that to happen, but it will happen if you do this. I'm going to quickly go to the forward to the fourth edition, forward to the third edition, sorry. All three paragraphs just talk about the growth of the fellowship. We now have 1 million groups, 1 million recovered alcoholics by the time we get to 1976. There's 28,000 groups meeting in over 90 countries. The last part, it tells you a little bit when it was translated into Spanish, into French. The last paragraph is so lovely. In spite of the great increase in the size and the span of the fellowships, at its core, this is so important, it remains simple and personal. Each day somewhere in the world, recovery begins. One alcoholic talks with another alcoholic, sharing experience, strength and hope. When one alcoholic shares with another alcoholic, sponsorship. That's what they're talking about. And the forward to the fourth edition, who knew? 2001, another edition was released. You can see the numbers there for yourself. This is, who even thought, the last paragraph talks about modem to modem. 2001, they were talking about being online, and who would have thought that the whole thing around this pandemic that happened a few years ago would have enabled us to be sitting on this platform, actually sharing the word of AA. And in the second paragraph in the forward to the fourth edition, it talks about a few lines down in country after country where the AA seed was planted. It is taking root slowly at first, then growing by leaps and bounds. But what they're talking about here is where the AA seed was planted, where the literature was planted, where the book was planted. That's when the recovery begins. The next paragraph then goes on to talk about, again, the growth of the fellowship, and we'll talk about that as we continue. But this last paragraph, there's a really important line in here. It talks about that modem to modem, which we're sharing with each other as we go through on these Saturday meetings. But if you go down to the fifth line from the bottom, it tells us, in any meeting, anywhere, AA share experience, strength and hope with each other, sponsorship, in order to stay sober. Circle those two words. To stay sober, recover, permanent, and help other alcoholics. Sponsorship. Modem to modem, face to face, doesn't matter. AA speak the language of the heart. Circle that word heart in all its power and simplicity. And I'll tell you why I've asked you to circle the word heart in a future edition. We come to these fellowships to recover. We come to these fellowships to stay sober. That's what we're here for. So on that note, Broken Down Record is going to stop talking. You'll be glad of the rest. Julie, I'm sorry that I went on too long, but that means we get into a clean start next week for the doctor's opinion.